Good morning. It's great to see you all today. I'm happy to be back. Um, Today, I advertised that I was going to be speaking on the precepts, especially the precepts of not killing. And I just pivoted in the last few minutes, so I hope you'll tolerate that. So I prepared the talk on the precepts, but I really feel like what's on my mind most is grief today. So hold on just a second. And I don't know, I guess for obvious reasons, we crossed a threshold in the United States of 600,000 COVID deaths yesterday. I don't know if y'all recall how shocking or heartrending it was when we reached 100,000. We here we honored that by creating a service, as you do in Buddhist world, and the New York Times had a front page feature where they tried to list the names, and what they were able to do was to list 1,000 only, which seems so small, but it took so much space, and it was impossible to read them all. There were just too many. They tried to tell little stories about a lot of the people who had died to make them real, and it was kind of impossible to read all of those stories. And here we are today, right at a year later, at 600,000. Who would have thunk it a year ago? I think, I remember people saying, oh, it won't be that many. And what does that many even mean? So, such a weird concept. Many or less in the face of death. So this is what's on my mind today, and I wanted to talk about grief and what is grief. I was asked by my friend this week, about the Buddhist teachings, how they relate to grief, and we have teachings on death and the role of death, which is, just to make it very simple, death teaches us how to live our lives. And then we have the Five Remembrances, and at the end, I'm of the nature to die. All things that I love are of the nature to die. There is no escape death. My deeds are my closest companions. My deeds are the ground on which I stand. So death teaches us how to live our life, through a deep understanding of impermanence and the deep knowledge that all is fleeting. Yesterday, my close friend's daughter graduated from high school, and I think a lot of people are in this situation this weekend. But she was so small, so recently, she was the cutest little thing when she was a baby. And here she is, a woman graduating from high school. And the next thing you know, she'll be taking care of her mom and having her own babies, maybe. So this knowledge of the fleetingness of life gives us an urgency to our practice. And for those of us who practice, bringing up death is a good way to kind of to motivate ourselves, not from some morbid point of view, but just with the understanding that, we don't have much time, so we better use it well. I've been feeling that myself a lot lately. I had a couple of milestones this past year. One was I turned 50, and prior to that, I had been sick myself with COVID, and initially I really thought this, I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought, oh good, I'm glad I got it early. I'm going to get this out of the way. I'm going to have immunity, and everybody's going to get it one day, so I may as well get it done with. And things didn't go exactly like I planned on that day. And I found that I, even now still have health effects from it. So then what is that? For me, it's a strong motivator. What do I really want to do in this life? What is the absolute most important thing? How much time do I have? I have no idea. So I better use it really well. So this is the classic teaching on death and impermanence. Let's let it motivate us to be inside out, to treat others well, to practice like our head's on fire, to really live an ethical life. And then what is grief? Grief isn't the same as death. It's not the same as the suffering of loss. Grief is an emotion, a really deep emotion that we're all going to experience in some way, shape, or form in our lifetime. Last year around this time, or maybe a little later, I spoke a few times about ambiguous grief and how difficult it is to move through grief when we're not quite sure what we're grieving. And I would say we still have some traces of that. What are we grieving? We're grieving almost too much to simply grieve. We're grieving a lot. But now we're moving back into being able to go out, and a lot of the initial terror is easing off. And I think we know a little bit more what we're grieving today than we did last year. And as you may recall, for ambiguous grief, the best thing is community and not isolating. So, grief. Personally, I think of grief as a bruise. That's the visual for me. Grief is an energy. It lives somewhere out here in front of the heart. And it doesn't have edges. It's a purple color. It's the color of a bruise. And it's sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller. It's cousin to sadness, and it has a lot of elements of sadness, but in some ways it's deeper than sadness. And in other ways it's less specific than sadness. Grief as a bruise. A bruise sometimes when it's fresh really hurts, and it can hurt whether or not we touch it, and it's visible to others. And then over time the bruise fades. But, if we touch it, it still hurts. And we know it's there. I don't know if you remember, I don't know how maybe I was a weird kid, but as a kid, when the bruise turned green, that was fascinating for me. So then I would, is that still, an ouch? Yeah, it hurt. but why is it turning green? It's a different thing now. So over time, the bruise fades. And then later, the bruise isn't there. But often we retain a memory of that bruise, especially if it was a really deep bruise. So for me, this is grief. So then, what is that from a Buddhist perspective? So first, I want to talk about from the perspective of feelings as feelings. When we have emotions coming up, especially deep emotions, it's important to acknowledge them, to really feel it, to allow ourselves to feel it. And there are different ways. We often talk about this. Where is it in my body? Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? Is it big or small? A vapor, or really concentrated, deep, external? Where is it? And then, what does it have to teach me? This week we talked about our difficult emotions as beautiful monsters and engaging with them from a place of curiosity. So asking it what it has to teach doesn't take words. And it's not exactly like teaching. It's more, so you could say, what am I going to learn from this experience? Or maybe just I accept. And then if it has something to say, then it can. So holding it very gently, but with intention, and letting it speak when it needs to speak. And sometimes it has something to say to us. Like I said, in my case, don't waste this life. I remember a close friend of mine died when I was in my 20s. She had been my mentor, and I loved her so deeply. Her name was Fanny. And I had been abroad and had just come back. And I was planning on seeing her the next day, or maybe the next couple of days. But I stopped off to see my sister first, and I got a call from my mom that Fanny had died. So sad. And I came back home. I went to her funeral. After a funeral, this is in the South, so sometimes people get together and, in this case, drink bourbon, So her ex-husband, Walt, offered me bourbon, and I guess I was hoping for a little bit, and he gave me a Walt pour, which was like this. So we sat around and just talked about her and laughed and told stories. And then later when I got home, I was outside and the grief just hit me. Boom. My whole body was consumed by grief. And so much that I fell down onto the ground and just wept from my guts inside out. Just really let it out. I don't think I just wailed, because I probably didn't want my mom to come out. But if that grief had a sound, it would have been a really loud wail. And then I stood up and I realized that I felt okay. I still felt that bruise, but it didn't feel, the wail wasn't there. And for just a moment, I thought, oh, I'm doing this wrong. I should still feel that wail. But then I realized, no, you feel what you feel, And feelings aren't static. Feelings constantly come and go, just like everything in life. So when we're feeling a relief or even laughter, and we feel like we should be feeling grief, then we're not in the present moment. And that gave me such a insight. Oh my goodness. We hold on to things. We hold on to emotion, not just grief. I mean, grief is a really stark example, Sometimes we can go through life feeling, oh, I just laughed. Oh no, I'm dishonoring the person who died. Or I just cracked a smile. I must be losing them. That's not how it is. It's not how anything is. Everything that arises falls away. This is how life goes. So I was thinking also about the tasks of mourning and how those relate to grief. So they come from William Worden, and there's something I had studied when I was training to be a chaplain. And for me, they really line up with the Buddha's teachings. So the first task is accepting the reality of the loss. And that's not an easy task. And, today, as we look at 600,000 people who have died, how can we possibly accept this reality? It doesn't feel real at all. And we all know it's more than 600,000. If I were one of the, I didn't die, fortunately, but if I were one of the numbers, I'm not on any charts. I never had a positive test. I was only diagnosed later. How many more people were sick and died without being counted? So it's a lot. So the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. Just as in Buddhist practice, we focus on being in the present moment, accepting the reality of what we have right here and right now. Sometimes we like it, sometimes we don't like it, sometimes we feel neutral about it. And regardless, what we have right here, right now, on our plate at this moment is what we have to work with. We don't get a choice. This is what we have to work with right here and right now. This is accepting the reality. And when we're grieving, it's accepting the reality of the loss. Nothing that we do will make that person come back. So the first task is to accept. And it takes time. We can't rush it. We have to give ourselves space for this. Accept the reality. The second task is to experience the pain of the grief. And I just spoke about that a little bit when I was talking about Fanny. It comes at its own time. And sometimes it comes really spontaneously. For those who have lost, we know it can come up at the tiniest things. And then other times when we really want to access it, it won't come. For me, this was often the case in the last year with COVID. It was just too much sometimes. And we were afraid and, worried and just trying to cope. And so many times I couldn't cry. But I remember the times that I was able to cry, to experience the pain of the grief. And it was such a relief. There was the time my cousin, Debbie, wanted to come to New York to volunteer to be a respiratory therapist. In the middle of all of that, I was so touched by it. I really cried. It was when my uncle David got sick, and then later my dad. There were other times too. I mean, we each have our own. So the important thing is not to push away, not to grab, but to allow that pain to happen. And when it's not there, not to grab for it. We don't need like a headline that says, Tenku is grieving every moment of every day, because that's not how it works. We feel it when we feel it. When we don't feel it, we don't grab. But we do allow it to come up. We allow it rather than grab it. The next task is to adjust to a world without the deceased. And this takes moving through the first two tasks. And as with so many things, these don't happen in a set order. And sometimes we go backwards, sometimes forward. But the next task is to adjust to an environment without that person that we lost. This is what's so hard right now with COVID, because we're still losing so many. When do we get to grieve this? We've had just this ongoing bruise for well over a year now. And each time the bruise starts to turn green, boom, turns purple again. So it's hard to find that way to adjust to the environment without the one we've lost. See, sometimes each new one that comes along can even sort of displace one. This morning, as I was thinking of names during our service, I sort of went blank for a minute, and then another one came out. And then, oh my goodness, it's only been 6 months since that one died. So adjusting to a world without the deceased in it. And this requires, some memories, some letting go, community holding us, and then continuing. And then finally, using that energy of the grief in a new way. Grief, and this comes into, what does grief have to teach us as Buddhists? Grief, as grief, the bruise fades and grief recedes, we're nevertheless irrevocably altered. And that doesn't have to be terrible. Our hearts can be more open, more tender. Once we've lost, we can get a tiny glimpse of what others who lose may be going through. We can start to understand what it is to lose. We can start to be more caring in the way that we live our life, less cut off. So how do we take that experience and use that energy for the benefit of others? How do we carry it forward? This is the question that we have to ask ourselves, and I don't think I can answer that for you. I think that has to be unique to each person. So grief, the bruise, so tender and so poignant, so inexpressible, and so needing of community. Absolutely nothing to say. And yet we must say, we must do the service, we must honor it. Not pushing away, not grabbing. Letting our hearts be tender and open. and filled with love and kindness for the benefit of all. Thank you.